So after the legislation was implemented, we decided that the only way that we were going to be able to extract information about the impact of the legislation from a constructivist perspective was to be able to go into the case files. So we had anticipated that we would read all the case files of the 25 youth that had been waived to adult court the 10 years prior, and then we thought, well, there'll be another 10 youth or so that will be waived the year after the legislation's been implemented. And so we had hired a series of research assistants, and we were going to read the case files. Well, if you've ever seen any of those case files, they are usually quite large. They're usually quite messy. They're not intended for researchers. They're intended for the system to document what's happening, right? So when we originally started, there were only approximately 35. And as I said, then all of a sudden there were 88 cases, which meant that we had gone from a small number of cases to examine to a huge number of cases to examine, which take quite a bit of time. The other issue is that we ran into the ethical considerations of not being able to take the case files out of the location where they were archived. They were also active case files, so we had to go to wherever the case file was. We could only code while we were in that particular space, and we also decided, given the sensitive nature of the information and the confidentiality of the information, only one person was going to be allowed to code, which ended up being me. So while we anticipated having 6 research assistants, what ended up being a 6-month project ended up being a year and a half. The advantage of using the case files is because we were taking a systems of care approach, in those case files is where the information about how the system is documented what's supposed to be provided to these youth, or what was provided to these youth. So even though one might say that we really should have interviewed the youth, we did interview the professionals to fill in the gaps. Really, we felt that embedded in those case files is really the representation of how the system was functioning. And to understand why the system was functioning differently after the implementation of the legislation, these case files was really where all that information was going to lie. We had access to a lot of very confidential, very sensitive information. We had also gotten a legal opinion that allowed us to be able to take case information that was available from social services, from child welfare, from the education system, from the medical system, and combine them into one case file, or at least allow us to code from all those different case settings and combine them into one case file per youth. That's a lot of confidential information, and almost no one ever has that information in one place. So we were required to get some protection for that case to protect the individual and to protect the researcher from that information being able to be subpoenaed, which in the States is called a certificate of confidentiality. In Canada, there are some current movements towards providing a mechanism for protecting that kind of research information. So we got that certificate of confidentiality. We were able to protect that information, but nonetheless, we had to de-identify that information in order to be able to take it out into an analyzable data file. So after coding from each of those files and collapsing that information, that's highly identifiable. So then going back through that case file and de-identifying it so that we could actually take it out and analyze it was another ethical consideration. The other thing that we realized as we were going through this project is we had a lot of information about how the professionals themselves had acted, either the treatment that was or wasn't provided, the kinds of documentation about what had or hadn't happened for these youth, especially as they moved into those different systems of care. And we realized that we had a lot of bystander risks because we had information about the professionals and those systems, which led to a fair number of potentially identifiable gaps, potential lapses in professional not behavior so much, but sort of professional lapses in what these youth might have been able to be provided or decisions that had been made. So we decided to extract that information altogether. We were not making judgments about whether those specific professionals or the specific systems were themselves doing right or wrong, but whether or not for that particular youth, the information as it came together to decide to waive this youth to adult court was what we were focusing on. So we had to we extracted a lot of that information to make sure that we weren't taking with us what was sensitive information about other bystanders that had not consented to have their data gathered. We used 3 methods in this study. We used content analysis, we used interviews, and we used process mapping. So the content analysis was conducted with the case files themselves. They were with all of the youth, as I said, that had been waived to adult court prior to the legislation being implemented, and then all of the case files up through a year after the legislation had been implemented, and that was an additional 88. So that content analysis, as I said, was intended to provide us with a constructed picture of what was happening to those youth and what was the content of the decision that was made to waive them to adult court and what had happened to them after that. We use interviews, semi-structured interviews. They were specifically intended to fill in the gaps around those particular cases. So we didn't interview key informants throughout the system. In fact, we didn't have access to some of the key informants that we wanted to talk to about the legislation, but we did have access to people who were knowledgeable about the specific cases. So when there was a gap in our understanding of what had happened in that case, we tried to find individuals that could fill in that gap. So we used semi-structured interviews with those particular individuals. And then we used process mapping. Process mapping is where someone describes the process by which a policy is implemented. So in other words, who is the first person that does anything with this policy when it's implemented? Who are the decision makers? What information is gathered in order to be able to respond to whatever the policy is prescribing? And you can map then how these individuals were supposed to be moving through either the juvenile justice system or into the waiver into adult court. So we used that with the key informants so that we could get a sense of whether or not the implementation of this legislation varied across these different systems and across the different jurisdictions. One of the criticisms of content analysis is that it is done without context. So looking at a case file in its without being in the context of people making those decisions or who is providing information is one of the criticisms. It tends to be superficial, it tends to be a bit thin, it tends to lead you to make decisions or arrive at conclusions that are not grounded in context. So that's one of the criticisms of content analysis. And as we were going through the case files, we did discover that there were ways in which we couldn't understand what was written in the case file or why certain decisions had been made. So that's why we use semi-structured interviews to be able to provide us with that additional information, to provide us with the context of what was happening in that case file. And then process mapping was used because we realized as we were going from case file to case file in different jurisdictions that the policy was being implemented differently. And so we thought, well, the process mapping is going to give us this picture.